What is not a bullet that you dodged, but a huge tactical nuke that you dodged? I was engaged to someone, but then came to my senses and broke it off. 9 months later, I found out she got married to someone else. Then about 1 year after that, she killed her husband. After a night of partying, a bunch of us wanted to go watch the sun come up at a local beach when we had just graduated from high school. There wasn't a sober one amongst us, and one guy volunteered to drive in his minivan. A few of us said no, let's watch it from the deck, but he said he was sober enough. I just had a bad feeling, and a bunch of us stayed back and slept it off at the house. We were all woken up a few hours later at about 8 a.m. to a phone ringing off the hook, cops, and freaking out parents. These were pre-cell phone days. They were in a really bad single-car rollover accident. 4 of 6 were dead. No one was wearing a seatbelt. They would have had to have taken a curve at about 160 kilometers per hour. That was a rough summer. Yesterday I was driving and waiting for the left turn arrow to turn green. I kind of spaced out and then realized the arrow turned green about a second ago. And then I took my foot off the brake. As soon as I did that, a huge pickup truck ran the red light from my left and did not even tap the brakes. If I had not zoned out, the truck would have hit my door right where I was sitting, and I probably would not even be typing this right now. I was walking to work in the winter. Halfway through, a step forward under a sky bridge, when an icicle taller than me, about 6 feet, and probably 2 feet around at the base, crashes down right in front of my nose. If my bus had been a half a second earlier, if I had even walked a tiny bit faster, I would have been impaled from brains to balls. I was frozen in place for a minute, quietly surveying my near death. There was another pedestrian nearby who witnessed it, and the wide-eyed, ashen look on his face, he stared at me and confirmed just how narrowly fortunate I was that day. On a road trip in college with 4 friends, we stopped halfway for a pit stop because I had explosive diarrhea, and I was getting more sick by the minute. My friends carried on to Vegas and left me with one of the guys who rented us a car to return home. The friends that carried on got into a rollover. 1 died, and 2 will be injured for life. Leaving a campus tavern on a sunny summer afternoon, and walking barefoot with my friend on the warm rails of the train tracks, we commented that if a train were to come, we'd feel it in the tracks the same way the original inhabitants could put an ear to the tracks and hear a train coming from miles away. Not 2 seconds after that comment, the train horn sounded behind us. It was coming on at about 20 to 25 miles per hour, and we jumped off with only a few feet to spare. Glad the engineer happened to be looking. My wife and I were prepared to buy a nice riverfront property in 2019, but the owners, her dad and uncle, were dragging their feet. We had our down payment, and we were approved for the mortgage, and on top of that, we even had been living there and paying rent. Then the river rose 30 feet in 10 minutes, and we had to evacuate. The water kept rising. The house was destroyed before we bought it, so we did not buy it. I had a long commute home, and on a rare occasion, my husband drove into the city to meet me. I started for about 15 minutes before he did. On the stretch of Highway 101 that I needed to be on for about 20 miles, there was a big rig in front of me that seemed to be driving erratically. I got this weird feeling and just moved over to the next lane and accelerated past him. In my rearview mirror, I saw the big rig run over the car in front of him, flip to its side, crushing the cars in the next lane, where I had just been. My husband was behind the accident, and as the police were letting cars file past in a single file, he saw one of the crushed cars had a red bumper. He got home a couple of hours after me and said he'd never been so happy to see my red car in the driveway, that he'd been holding his breath, and as he turned down our street, because he really expected me to be under the rig. I had some chest pains one night, and I woke up to my wife to tell her. She got a little scared that it might be a heart attack and we agreed that I should go to the ER. The nurses were pretty sure it was a false alarm, but would run an EKG as it is common practice. In my head, I was hoping that the chest pain would come back, not to prove a heart attack, but so that we can find out what the chest pain was. The EKG was done by one veteran nurse and a new nurse. I was watching over their shoulders. Something was flashing on the screen that made both nurses look at each other with disbelief. They ran it again, and one nurse went out to the station for help. The other stayed with me and very nicely told my wife and daughter to go back to the waiting room. A few seconds later, 5 to 6 more people came into the room slowly and calmly and began prepping me for something. It turns out that I was having a second heart attack that night right in the ER. The doctors and nurses found an obstruction in my heart and were prepping me to have it cleared and a stent placed. When I got out of surgery, the doctor who placed the stent told me, "You probably picked the best time and place to have a heart attack, right here in the ER." I was working on the construction of a power plant and was scheduled to work on Sunday. On Saturday, I got a call from another company asking me to run a job much closer to my house. Think 5-minute commute versus 50. So I accepted the job and I did not go to the power plant that Sunday. That day, there was an explosion at the plant and people in the crew I was working with wound up getting killed. A few years ago, I was in a small fender bender. Someone merged into my lane with me in it, and then smashed my driver's side door and their passenger door together. I had pulled my arm in front, having it hanging out the window about 15 seconds before that happened. I would have most likely had my arm ripped off. I was driving home from visiting my brother in Vermont when a snowstorm started. I did not have much experience driving in serious snow, and I completely lost control. The car careened off the road and I was heading for a giant boulder at around 50 or 60 miles per hour. I felt time slow down and I reflected on my life for a moment, and then I said goodbye to my body. Suddenly, I was jolted out of it by an abrupt impact, but I could see that the boulder was still 20 or 30 feet away. When I got out of the car, I saw that I had hit a skinny little tree that I could have easily grabbed with one hand. However, it had a giant root system that lifted the car off the ground and stopped me. The car was totaled, but I was completely fine because of that little tree. There is no way I would have survived that impact. I have some acres of woodland that I take care of with a chainsaw to keep a desirable mix of tree species and avoid overcrowding. Often when I cut the trunk of a tree that's too close to the other trees, it just leans against them rather than falling down. Then I have to make a series of angled cuts and let chunks of the trunk slide off, more or less vertically onto the ground. Eventually, the trunk winds up vertical enough that I can push it toward a clear space and complete the process of felling the tree. Well, a couple years ago, I was getting to that point. The tree was basically vertical, a few thousand pounds of wood balanced on its end, reaching 30 feet up. I made another cut, and the rest of the trunk slid down off of the 3 feet or so of trunk that I'd separated from it at the base. And then it started to lean. That sucker was coming down. Except it wasn't going in the direction that I planned. No big deal, just to move out of the way. Except I'd gotten careless and left a bunch of branches down there at my feet, and I was disturbed to find that my legs could not move. I was stuck rooted to that spot, which was very close indeed to the way the tree was moving. It wound up just nicking my head on its way down, another few inches, and it would have done a lot more than that. I was chatting with a woman at the bar. Nothing flirtatious, just casual banter. I told her I needed to head out and she asked if I could give her a ride. I was headed that way, so it was not a big deal. We pull into her driveway and I can see a guy at a computer in the living room through the window. I ask who it is and she replied, "That's my husband, he's a pansy. I'll bring him outside and you scare him off. Then we can have the house all to ourselves for the night." Every alarm bell in my head was ringing, and all I could think was, how do I get this crazy out of my truck without a big scene? So I said, sounds good. As soon as she was halfway to the door, I put it in gear and burned rubber. I really liked my professor advisor in college. In my senior year, I took a graduate course he offered. It was on nuclear fusion history and technology, and he was an expert in the field, and it was really interesting and a challenging elective. As a senior in a graduate class, it was really interesting to have a class with just 2 or 3 other students. All of them were graduates, and at least 2 worked with the professor at the side company he had founded. As the year progressed, as I tried to figure out where I was going after I graduated, the professor offered me a spot in his graduate program and a job at his company. I had recently married at the time, and my wife had already graduated from college. In the place she worked, a lead tech support for a startup ISP offered her a full-time business analyst job, her dream job at the time. After much consternation, we went a different path and moved away. Within the next couple of years, the startup my wife worked for went out of business less than a year later. My professor was arrested returning from an overseas seminar for sharing classified nuclear information. He ended up serving time in prison and his company was closed. One of his employees, a graduate student, also pled guilty and served time. I believe he was one of the other students in the class. One of his employees was identified as a foreign national and was arrested and deported. I believe he was one of the other students in the class. Often in life you make decisions with the best information you have, and you'll never really know if you made the right one. In this case, I know beyond a doubt that my wife and I made the right decision.